everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll get started in a minute. At the end, we will have a Q&A, so you can use the Q&A chat feature on the webinar, or you can also use the raise your hand feature, and we can unmute you to ask any questions verbally if you would choose to use that route instead. So I'll pass it over to our presenters, and we'll get started.
Thank you, Kate. Just confirming, can everybody see my screen? Scientifically sound security medical device risk assessment. Andrew's nodding. Thank you. So thank you for joining our webinar today. It is 10 o'clock. We'll get started. We are presenting scientifically sound security medical device risk assessment, which is a huge subject, but specifically zeroing in on a way to model dollar-based risk from security. So what we'd like to offer, and we hope we can take away from attending this webinar, is awareness of some of the pitfalls of common product security risk scoring techniques, some understanding of principles of improved risk metrics, and an introduction to an alternative. At the end, we're going to provide, or most of the work will be providing an example and a demo of how dollar-based risk modeling can translate product security risk into business risk. Let's see. First, quick introduction. I am Shannon Lancey. I'm VP of Consulting at MedCrypt. I lead our consulting practice, and prior to MedCrypt, I led 2 groups at Booz Allen, a co-founded Secure Connected Health group, and regulatory innovation. My background before outside of consulting is in consumer decision making and uncertainty. So I am a decision science nerd, and we have teamed up with Hubbard Decision Research in this area. Andrew, you want to give an introduction?
So I'm Andrew Adams. I'm the Director of Consulting Operations at Hubbard Decision Research. My background is applied mathematics, and I've been working at HCR for several years now. And what we try to do is apply mathematics to real-world problems in many different subject spaces. But I also have spent a lot of that time working in cybersecurity, so we're trying to kind of merge the 2 sets of excellence between medical device risk and cybersecurity in this kind of joint project.
Thanks, Andrew. All right, so I'm going to give some lead up to problem statements and use cases for a dollar-based risk simulator. And then Andrew's going to demo our dollar-based risk simulator. And we'd love to provide an opportunity for chat and discussion at the end. We'll figure out whether or not we do that either live or through the Q&A, but we'll get started now. So lead up, stoplight risk scores. We are all very familiar with them. And they're used as critical inputs to decision making, especially in medical device cybersecurity. So how does a specific vulnerability get a stoplight score? At a very high level, there's some structured data and some policies that are explicit and observable. And there's some unstructured and unwritten information, often knowledge of the specific product configuration, use environment, etc. Expert judgment is often hidden, but a critical part of determining a risk score. So for example, a cybersecurity expert may not be able to codify or have time to codify every single piece of reasoning that goes into scoring the risk. This is normal, it makes sense. Once we get a risk score, what does it mean? And what should we do about it? Again, we use explicit and written policies, and then a lot of unwritten judgment that goes into the decision. Mental models of patient risk, of revenue risk, and business risk tolerance. And with those explicit policies plus decision maker judgment and the risk scores, we get decisions. And those not familiar with MedCrypt webinars, MedCrypt is 100% focus on medical device cybersecurity. So we are bringing in decision modeling, but all of the use case today we'll discuss medical device cybersecurity. So decisions like whether or not we need to have an emergency out-of-cycle patch, which has business implications and patient safety implications, whether or not we need to increase a budget for a particular product or across our corporate product security, have a new investment or a new legacy device policy. These are all examples of decisions that are influenced by risk scoring policies and judgment. But we have a problem. So risk scores, specifically stoplight chart scores, are really hard to translate into sound decision-making at scale. And they've got unstructured and unwritten data, which is fine for decision-making at a local level or once, but at scale, it lacks translation. Relying on expert judgment, unwritten understanding of a product architecture and its use environment is important, but also leads to trouble. Varying scores, so inconsistent scores based on who's making them, causes some trouble. And it's separation from evidence, labor intensive, the fact that they are labor intensive, and we'll get into the fact that stoplight charts are ordinal scaled and lack units lead to systemic problems. So the problems that we'll go over specifically today, I'm guessing many of you are familiar with because you are deep in the trenches. The audience today is deep in the trenches of evaluating scores for product security across multiple products or individual products. But we'll go into a bit of detail about how these problems with stoplight charts leads to lack of translation to safety, heated internal debate, mathematical error, barrier to automation, and the focus today, lack of translation to business risk. So lack of translation to safety can fail to prevent loss of life. When we talk about medical device cybersecurity, at least at MedCrypt and almost all of the device manufacturers that I talk to on a regular basis, the number one priority is patient safety. This slide shows a picture of the Challenger, Space Shuttle Challenger. And as probably everybody knows, Space Shuttle Challenger blew up as a result of failed parts at low temperatures at launch. The engineers at Challenger knew that the parts would fail at below freezing temperatures. They communicated this knowledge to managers or people who could make decisions not to launch. The decision was made to launch anyway. This failure to prevent the loss of life based on a rare or previously undetected risk is sort of widely attributed to poor risk communication. Heated debate leads to waste of time in adversarial teams. If you have lack of units on a stoplight chart and you have a bunch of teams with the different equities and different motivations, you're gonna have a lot of trouble figuring out what's a high, what's a medium and low. And I've seen personally, cyber R&D, marketing research, or QA and RA argue high, medium and low because it has a lot of implications on their work. But the arguments kind of go in circles because of the previously identified issues with stoplight cars. So mathematical error, when we take a high and a medium and try to figure out whether or not they sum to a high or a medium, or we can multiply likelihood and impact, we get improper aggregation and mistrust in scoring, which we'll go into a little bit more detail later. But a critical principle here is that anything that we want to aggregate or quote, do math on needs units. So dollars or hours or number of lives or loss of availability. Barriers to automation from our stoplight scores hinder continuous improvement. When we were developing this webinar, we debated whether a waterfall would be a useful descriptive photo of hindering continuous improvement. But if we step back, it used to be that medical devices were hardware devices that were developed once, they got through regulatory review and rigorous assessment of safety and efficacy, and then got to market and mostly stayed safe. Now with software, safety of software changes over time based on security. New vulnerabilities come up, new safety evaluation is needed. Also, software can be updated at a lot more speed. Sometimes we call it agile development. But if we can't scale our risk assessment and our scoring of risk, we can't scale or speed up our software release and our continuous safety assessment. So we're stuck in more of the waterfall style of development. Waterfall's not bad, but they slow us down. So lack of translation to business risk may lead to underinvestment. So I'm sure that there are at least some people on this webinar who represent product security at medical device companies that feel like they have a full and complete budget for everything that's necessary in order to get their product to market with sufficient and appropriate security. But for some of us, if nobody could detect the sarcasm there, a lot of the industry feels under-resourced for sufficient and appropriate product cybersecurity. But how much should we budget? What is appropriate? And how much tolerance should we have for the inevitable residual risk, even when we do a good job? All right, so I've basically complained about stoplight charts for the last 5 slides or so. But what of an alternative? When we show you this model that we hope might be helpful, it's got to satisfy a lot of our current needs. Stoplight charts work right now for a lot of our needs. They're practical, they're easy to implement, they're easy to understand, and they meet a lot of stakeholder needs. So an alternative needs to be at least as good at many of those attributes. Especially aligns to regulatory requirements, aligns to how we already make decisions, can't require a ton of new data, needs to be able to produce actionable results. We need to be able to understand outputs and can incorporate some of the other major changes in the industry, including SBOMs and vulnerability surveillance approaches. This is key. We want any alternative to be measurable. How much better is it? And how much can we improve the risk assessment approach? I'm going to show this slide again later, but I just wanted to put forward a few of the use cases that we're considering and that we are working with folks on this type of modeling with, and the use cases that Andrew and his firm uses outside of medical device cybersecurity. So legacy device safety risk, continuous monitoring and metrics dashboards, which is very hot right now, and related to reporting to a board, reporting risk scores to a board, corporate risk tolerance, ROI analysis on investments. I will note, this is not ROI on patient safety. Given a patient safety level, if there's multiple options for meeting that patient safety assurance, comparing ROI between investment options, and risk return analysis on policy. If a corporation wants to implement a brand new policy, it's going to make a lot of change. Might want to do due diligence on how that policy is going to impact all parts of the business. So how can we do that? Well, here's the magic. So I'm going to walk through sort of the logic of the model, an example risk assessment model translated into revenue risk in dollars. Step 1, to model revenue loss using existing data, policies, and decisions. We estimate a baseline risk. We will show you how that baseline risk can be rooted in reality, but we also note that the value of this model will be relative. So the baseline risk is not as important as the relative risk of products. Step 2, objective data. So objective data that can be codified and documented and put into a model. And then step 3, objective risk modifiers. We can create estimates from evidence, experts, and policies to then create a model with a Monte Carlo simulation. These risk modifiers and the objective data replace the black boxes that were of undocumented analysis and data and augment into something that we can inspect and repeat, measure the performance of, and improve. And then you've got step 5, measure and improve the model. I'm rushing here. I think we'll have lots of time for questions and answers, but one thing I wanted to make sure we mention is in cybersecurity, specifically cybersecurity of medical devices, including FDA's current post-market guidance, when we talk about likelihood, it's often an argument because likelihood should be assumed to be 1, a hacker is going to hack, and we should look at exploitability. In this case, when we talk about likelihood, we're talking about likelihood of revenue loss and exploitability analysis and exploitability rating is performed in the objective data plus risk modifiers. So Andrew, I'm going to ask you to pop in and support this a little bit, but how do you assess a baseline risk of revenue loss for products without data or without a lot of data?
And so what we want to try to do here is just show people that there are a lot of different options that you could use to get this data. You have a lot more data than you think. And just a couple examples of how you could turn that data into some very simple but useful metrics that you could use in your model, several of which you could use in the model that we're going to show in a little bit. So one thing you're probably going to want to measure is the likelihood of revenue loss or the likelihood of a negative event. So if you have a portfolio of devices and you're keeping track of those devices, for example, or they don't even just have to be your devices, they could be kind of the industry-wide devices. If you had 50 devices and a history over 10 years, you actually have 500 device years that you can do a probabilistic analysis on. So if we thought events were 5% likely on an annual basis, we would expect approximately 25 incidents in the sample. And we have a lot of different methods. We're showing one on the screen down there with a Bayes distribution that we can use to actually calculate these probabilities. For the impact to revenue loss, you could do a very similar idea that we could do with probability. What you could do is build a distribution of expected fines from a series of past incidents. So this was one we did in the insurance industry using a log normal distribution. What you'll see is it's a pretty decent fit. So what we're able to do is use a set of incidents, compute the fitted log normal distribution, and then we can go and use that distribution going forward in our estimates. And all of this stuff can be recursively updated with new information as you obtain it. But the main point we wanted to make is that you probably have more data than you're expecting, and it's actually not that hard to turn that data into very useful information that you can use in your modeling. I'll pass it back to Shannon.
So I'm worried that I'm muted. I'm not muted. So thank you, Andrew, for going through the evidentiary basis and the mathematical basis, which is rooted in other traditions that we can grab reasonable estimates of a baseline risk. In addition to what we could get internally, what you people at medical device manufacturers or in this space could do with your own data, there are cases of loss, business risk, or sorry, revenue loss that are public and in the industry space that we can use as examples. So for our demo, we chose a likelihood that next year or over the next time period, there's a 2.5% chance of loss, and the impact of that loss would be between 2.5% and 5% of the revenue of a marketed product, so sort of geared towards post-market product. And you kind of think of it as a legacy device risk product, risk assessor. So going to the steps, step 2, collect and structure objective data on observable product traits. This data exists already. Many companies have product profiles that give them a snapshot of ongoing product risk. And there are many sources where you could get this structured or unstructured data, usually already created once a product gets to market. And so what's a risk modifier? This is where it seems like the magic happens, but it's really a product of what already happens when decisions are made inside of companies. It just makes it explicit, and we estimate those modifiers. So say we have the baseline list of any given product, and we've got observable traits. An example is, let's look at the cryptography traits of a product. Is asymmetric cryptography used? This is a best practice in the market. Are keys generated on a device? Yes. Are certificates revocable in the field? Yes. These are attributes of a functioning cryptography architecture. Immediately, the example breaks down if I don't give a lot of detail, but we can get into the discussion of it at the latter half. But in any case, say you've got observable traits that represent bits of the security posture of a device. These traits reduce the likelihood of revenue loss in some way. The risk modifier is an estimate of how much those traits reduce the baseline likelihood of a revenue loss. And we'll show you how we can get those estimates. But in this example, if you've got asymmetric cryptography, keys are generated on the device and certs are revocable in the field, you reduce the baseline likelihood to 1.5% for a resulting 1.5% likelihood of revenue loss for that specific product in the next year. So how do we get to risk modifiers like that? I mean, this is really the critical process. We get to the risk modifiers by modeling what the decision makers are already doing. So one way, and probably one of the most common ways that Andrew and his team and decision scientists like me in my previous life, including at FDA, will model decision-making judgment is using structured, scientifically sound methods to elicit decision makers' existing knowledge. And so there are structured ways to do that in a calibrated manner so you can get an estimate of risk based on the person who would be making the decision. We also have corporate policies. They effectively create risk modifiers. For example, if you have a corporate policy that dictates that which vulnerabilities shall be remediated before a product is allowed to go to market or get released, this prevents revenue for a period of time or prevents market share or some other estimate of corporate impact. Historical evidence, like we said earlier, there are a couple examples in the public of major recalls or delays to market based on cybersecurity alone. And then this is critical, rules of math and logic. So units on quantities must be unambiguously defined. The risk modifiers, probabilities and impacts can be combined in simulations in a way that doesn't sort of violate the total rules of probability and prediction. And the rules that we use and Hubbard decision research uses are commonly used in very well-known and existing methods in actuarial science, including for insurance estimates and underwriting. Did I miss anything there, Andrew?
That's great.
And step 4, run the simulation. So I'm going to hand it over to Andrew to, demo a example of this. And while Andrew picks up the sharing, I'm going to look at the Q&A. We'll also say that before we go too far into it, our goal here today is to share a method rather than share the model itself. The model is an example of how the method can work. The model, this type of modeling is best suited for development internally at a company to reflect the company's own values, estimates, and data. It's not to say that this is how the industry should estimate risk. It should be, this is a model that can be used to better estimate risk according to existing corporate policies. All right, take it away.
I think I can help address some of those questions as we get towards the end as well. I think, but we'll open it up for a bit of a wider discussion. I was noticing a couple went towards the FAIR methodology, which we do know quite a bit about. So what we want to do with the demo was start at kind of the endpoint, or at least part of the endpoint, and then show you how to walk back everything really from the ground up into a fully functioning model. So one of the things, all the data in here is placeholder data. We're just going to put that out there. But it should give a relatively good example of how you can use this in the data that it can produce. The first point I want to make is that if you had this model and if you had all the data filled in for the risks that we want to measure, you can do a lot of really useful things with this. There's a lot you can do in terms of measuring risk, prioritizing risk, communicating risk that is actually very hard to do with traditional scoring metrics. So let's just walk through a couple of different outcome metrics that you can get, and then we'll really start right at the baseline level and build it all up from there. So one of the things you can do right off the bat is calculate an expected or average risk for a portfolio of different medical devices. So here our portfolio is going to have about 16 million in current or expected risk. What you can also do is measure the risk in the tail percentile. So this will give you about some idea of how bad could it get. So we have a 95th, 99th, and 99.9th different tail percentile. We can break all of these numbers down by different devices. So you're going to see the bar chart representation of it down here, as well as you can look at the expected current risk for 5 different devices that we're going to be talking a little bit about. So it's really easy in this type of method to spot which one has the most risk, as well as how much worse is it compared to the other elements that we want to look at. If you assign these different devices to a division or any other grouping that you really would care about, we can also look at the expected risk by division. So you could break these devices into division 1 and 2 and look at which division has what level of risk each division has, and if that level of risk is even acceptable. And the last chart I want to kind of draw everyone to, which is very common in a couple different methodologies, is the loss exceedance curve. What the loss exceedance curve is going to tell you is the probability, that's the y-axis, of exceeding a risk listed on the x-axis. And the red curve is going to be the relationship between these. You notice it's always decreasing as the risks increase because we're talking about the risk of exceeding those losses. This has elements which are very similar to value at risk, if you've ever seen that as before too. But what it really does is give you the whole profile of risk for this portfolio of devices. You can build these curves actually also for any one of these individual products. We're going to get back to the dash curve, but the key element of the dash curve, it's called a risk tolerance. And it's a policy statement that you can set so that everyone's on the same page about what level of risk is acceptable to your organization. So we're going to start over at the bottom now. How could we build up a model that makes sense for this portfolio of products? So we're going to start with a baseline risk for product risk from cybersecurity. What we're going to say is that for an average product, it's going to have a 2.5% likelihood of having something happen in a year. And we're going to scale the impact. We're going to do 2.5 million to 5 million per 100 million of revenue for the impact of this device if it has an issue. So what we're going to do first is break that information into two different sets of modifiers, which are going to help isolate what the product is and how risky that product is. We want these to be observable. That helps in a couple different aspects. It keeps everything clear. And later on, it's actually going to help a lot with automating your risk scoring for these different devices, because you can actually track things that should be able to be databaseable for these different products. So we're going to talk a little bit about likelihood, and then we're also going to move into a little bit about impact. So we decided that for our products, we've got a legacy bedside monitor with SneakerNet updates. We've got a legacy capital equipment moneymaker, which is connected to the internet, a legacy capital equipment moneymaker, which is disconnected from the internet, a new capital equipment device moneymaker, which has encrypted data, and a cloud-based SAMD diagnostic device. And we use these traits.
I'm so sorry, Andrew, but I got to jump in here. One of our audience members can identify himself in the Q&A, but he is the one that I got legacy device moneymaker term from and unabashedly use in this model. So thank you. If you want to reveal yourself in that Q&A, go ahead, Andrew.
And part of what we're trying to do with that is show how how just even the revenue of a device can be integrated into these models to help differentiate them. So we chose these traits to be the ones that we wanted to track to determine the likelihood profile of these different devices, whether or not they've been penetration tested and the findings remediated, if they had known unpatched vulnerabilities, have post-market management and the patches are up to date, if it's remotely accessible, the OS has been security hardened, if the data is encrypted, and if the device has malware defenses. Those are all objective traits for devices that you could go and query based off of your basically database of product information. We're going to answer yes, no to these traits, and these are going to use a method called log odds to aggregate that information with some estimates that we have off to the right. And we're going to estimate likelihood for each one of these different devices. What you'll see is due to the security posture, we have the legacy capital equipment moneymaker actually has a very high probability in comparison to the other device. This is largely because it has several elements of its security which have not been patched. Other devices that have more elements of their security patched are going to have a lower probability. For impact, we chose to use a modifier based on that range of impact that we decide above, which is also connected to the product's revenue. So same product profile, same order, but we chose slightly different traits as well as including some of the traits that we had before. So we've got the FDA classification, whether or not it's life-saving. If it is life-saving, does it fail safely when it's attacked? Does it have no unknown unpatched vulnerabilities? Has post-market management and patches are up to date? Device has the ability to back up and restore data. That's a different one. Device has an instant response plan. Data is encrypted, and device has malware defenses. So a few extra traits in here. The number of traits doesn't really matter. But what we're going to do is we're going to add up the different estimates that we have for these traits based on whether or not class 1, 2, or 3 for FDA classification, whether or not it even can be, whether or not it's life-saving, as well as yes, no for several of the other kind of security-related traits. What this gives us is an estimate on the impact of how much it would scale up based off of its risk, primarily to the patient. What we see is the legacy bedside monitor with SneakerNet updates is the highest, and the one we were looking at before, the capital equipment moneymaker, which is connected, is actually not that high in comparison to the other ones. It's a little bit higher than the average, but it's not the highest by far. What we're then going to do is take all of our products and use their revenue estimates to develop an interval for impact for each one of these different devices, given an event occurred. So how are we going to use all this information? We've got a bunch of likelihoods and we've got a bunch of impacts. And what we want to try to do is run a Monte Carlo simulation such that we can combine these probabilistically and look at, one, the risk of each of the individual devices, as well as the risk of the portfolio as a whole. Monte Carlos have been shown to improve estimation, largely by decomposition. So we're going to be using some of those principles as we move forward. So you'll see here, largely what we've done is we've just piped over the information that we had in the previous page. We all have all our products here. We've assigned them a division. This could be really any classification you want. We've carried over their probability as well as their impact estimates from the previous page. Now, one thing we can do, we're going to run 1,000 different simulations. Just from that, you can calculate the expected loss of each different product. What you can also see in this simulation is as I click through the different trials, you're going to see different simulated losses pop up over here. What this is representing is as I go through my 1,000 trials, I'm going to have different sets of losses come up in combination or just on their own. So if it's a 0, you didn't have any incident that year. If you have 2 pop up, you had 2 incidents in that year. If you go through a couple more, that was just one with 1 incident. We're going to take all this information in our 1,000 trials, and that's what's going to roll up back up into our example dashboard. So all of this information that we have here is all being computed from the estimates that I showed you before. The key major components are, it's not exceptionally difficult to create estimates which create a realistic picture of your devices, but the benefits you get on the back end from the information are really high, unambiguous, and well-defined, using methods that we know work. So normally the question that comes up when we're doing this at this point is, what should we do about it? Given that you have this risk profile, is it acceptable? What are our different options that we can do with it? What should be prioritized? What set of controls is optimal? All of this different information are pieces that we want to understand. So I'm going to switch to a different model. It's basically the same though, but with a couple pieces added. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about controls. I believe everyone should be able to see my Excel. If you can't, just please let me know. So this was the same picture that we saw before. We've got our current risk estimates here with our likelihood traits across the top, and those different yes and no's indicating where, what the device profile is for each one of these different traits. What we have over here to the right is an updated set of traits with remediation. So what we're going to do is we're going to say that we're going to enforce data encryption on these first 3 devices. So you'll notice in the device encrypted component here, we have 3 yeses. Those were previously no before. What that's done is lowered the attack probability because now we've increased the security profile of the device. They're not 0, not eliminated, just knocked down a bit because now we have the data encrypted on the device. We can do the same thing with impact. So we've got the data encryption here on the impact for the top 3 devices. Like before, it's lowered the impact modifier by removing basically a security gap. And all this is going to translate into the estimates for our impact ranges, as well as our new likelihood ranges, which we're going to bring into the Monte Carlo simulation. In the Monte Carlo simulation, we're just going to add an entire another component to it. So this was the component that we saw before. We've got our likelihoods, which are going to be sampled for if the event happens or not, our impacts for the impact if it happens. And we're going to add in another component here for the effectiveness of the controls. They're slightly out of order. That's why these 3 are in the middle. I just want to note that it is correct. So we've got 500,000 for the implementation out of encryption on our 3 devices. And what we're going to do is we're going to bring over the new likelihood on those devices, as well as the new impact ranges for those 3 devices. We're going to rerun the simulation. That's going to give us a expected loss with intervention, as well as a simulated loss with intervention. So you can have really 2 different types of behavior happen when you're looking at this type of a simulation. One is that the impact that happened was blunted. So this is where our reduction of impact really shows up. So the event still happened. You didn't prevent the event, but the severity of the event was reduced. You can see that in the 38 million being dropped down to the 31 million. So you can blunt an attack basically with an improved security profile. What you can also do is prevent the attack. That shows up when when the likelihood is no longer sufficient to trigger the event in the simulation. So in this example, that $19 million event happened in the current loss, did not happen in the residual loss. That's preventing an event. If we hop over to the dashboard, what we do is we actually just get more information. So what we have here is all the same information that we had before. For our expected current risk in the tail percentiles, you see all our red bars are there. The red loss exceedance curve is there as before, but we've added a certain set of things. So we now have the expected risk with our intervention, the portfolio risk reduction for that intervention, the cost of those interventions, as well as an ROI for those interventions. So it's starting to build up this case where it's not just estimating the risk, it's estimating the quality of our risk reduction. For our individual products, you can see it in the bar chart, but also over here. What we've done is we've reduced the current risk for our 3 products. 2 of them had a positive ROI, 1 of them had a negative ROI. That doesn't mean you wouldn't do it. You might not get all of your money back if you did do it. We can calculate the expected risk by division, same way we were doing before. And probably the most interesting part of this that showed up is this green curve showed up below the red curve. What this is we've lowered our risk profile from where the red curve was to the green curve. Using these curves together in tandem with our loss exceedance tolerance, what we can do is tell if our security investments were sufficient to bring our current risk below our stated risk tolerance. This is really how you start communicating with management or upper management on how much risk should be reduced to be acceptable to the population. So in this case, we brought the green curve almost totally under the risk tolerance. We might need one more control, but this is how we're going to measure if we did enough risk reduction based off of what leadership has asked us to do. We also have a little measurement here that will basically tell you the probability of exceeding a given loss. Given that, though, I think it would be best if we open it up to questions, and we can hopefully run through a chunk of them with the time we have left.
Andrew? So we would be happy to field any questions at this moment. I don't actually know if we can unmute people, so I will find that out. Well, if you have questions, add them to the Q&A section. I'll look real quick. And we'll also answer some questions live that were asked. So how would this device risk approach be applied for cybersecurity risks in a hospital network? The short answer is for this one, this is a product dollar revenue simulator. The better answer is the same types of modeling and the same types of risk modifier approaches that Andrew and I work together on could be used from a hospital's perspective. And you might want a risk of ransomware-based downtime or risk of systemic failure to be an outcome that you would model against, and then determine whether or not that risk or risk tolerance was exceeded with a new medical device that you're looking at purchasing if you're a hospital. I can imagine also that this being really useful for a public health use case where we're looking at systemic risk across multiple hospitals and evaluating whether or not a requirement for controlling risk would be overall positive or negative impact for the industry. I hope that made sense. I'm happy to go into it more. Trying to see if there are other questions.
The thing I might add to that is it also helps you aggregate your risks. So in kind of the stoplight chart, it's going to be very difficult to aggregate the different points because they're not really well defined. With a model like this, you can aggregate the risk of all your devices in the network. So it's a pretty powerful advantage. So I'll pass it back to Shannon.
Thanks, Andrew. So Hans asks, is the model impacted by the technical complexity of the product? This is a fantastic question. So this is really good for looking at across an entire portfolio. And when you're looking across an entire portfolio, you're probably taking a subset of information for each one of the products. Now, So maybe you know that you've got 8 products in a company or 100 products in a company, and you just kind of need to know whether or not their total revenue, they've got post-market vulnerability management set up, whether or not they've got good processes and controls in place, and if anything, major changes. So you need to know a subset of information to look at portfolio risk. Some of those products might be more technically complex, but at the corporate level or at the portfolio level, that complexity needs to be reduced to something that can form decisions. So Hans, I would say that in answer to your question, I'd say depends on what decisions you're making or what portfolio risk you're trying to estimate. And if you're looking across a whole portfolio, this is a suitable approach. If you want to look more into the technical impact of, for example, a major security overhaul of an existing product with a lot of technical complexity, this might be a different model, not the one that we showed here, but again, the similar methods are applicable. I'd like to know if my answers are getting there. Andrew, would you have anything to add on the technical complexity of a product?
I might just say that one of the key components that we're trying to strive for is we want to break down a product into its most useful factors. Part of the modeling process is, even if a product is complex, we want to try to be figuring out what are the most important components of it that we can use to then analyze the product. So it's part of the process. More complex things sometimes need more modeling, but we're really shooting for the core of what it affects as its kind of modeling component. And that's going to reduce the error kind of as quickly as possible in the most efficient method. I might jump in on answering Mac's question.
Yes, great.
So some subjective estimating is needed correct. What can HDR do about improving subjective estimates? As I thought there was one more with Max. What kind of training is needed to support this type of modeling? So one piece of training that HDR offers is something called calibration training. What that is, as well as our quantitative analyst training, it puts you through a series of exercises. It takes about 3 hours where you make judgments and estimates about certain quantities, largely from trivia questions, and then you get immediate feedback based off of the answers that you provide. What this tries to correct for is we make tons of judgments in our life every day, make tons of decisions in our life every day, tons of forecasts in our life every day, even if we don't know that we're doing it. The problem with this is that we don't actually get immediate feedback for a lot of them. A lot of them take several years, and there's some literature that basically shows people are a lot more likely to remember the times they were right than the times they were wrong. So what calibration training does is provide a well-documented methodology to train people to give estimates that truly represent their uncertainty. Doesn't mean that their uncertainty is going to be significantly smaller. Actually, in many cases, the other way. But what we want to try to do is get people to understand how to best phrase their uncertainty about making these different types of estimates. In this case, it would have been a lot of the modifiers for the impact and likelihood adjustments. The other thing we kind of strive to do in our modeling is we use methods that are measurable and that work. So 2 or 3 of the different methods that we looked at today actually have pretty substantial literature backgrounds that show that they are useful for improving estimates. So we kind of try to put those 2 together to get the best estimate possible. We do have research that show that these methods do improve upon the results significantly more than scoring. Scoring actually has several pieces of literature that suggest that you not do scoring in the mindset that a lot of people are doing it.
Thanks, Andrew.
There was one more up here. Sorry, go ahead. Do you want to pick one, Shannon?
Yeah, I wanted to add that the training needed to create a model that could be implemented as a sort of corporate risk dashboard or corporate risk estimator is different than the training that would be needed to use it, maintain it, keep it updated, communicate results, or elicit new data. And so the bolus of effort to create a model that a company or a product organization would need would be upfront work, sort of like training an AI model, but different. And then the use training would be much less difficult or time consuming. I shouldn't say difficult, just time consuming.
Those are great points. And we normally will rely on subject matter experts for medical devices to input some of that information.
So question, can you provide examples of mathematical units on quantities being assessed by subject matter experts? So couple things. We're actually not on this model. We're working on a different model that predicts the likelihood of deficiency or not substantially equivalent or a withdrawal based on specific cybersecurity attributes. And that's usually not predictable. It's very difficult to predict, and also it's changing a lot. But at MedCrypt, we happen to have a couple folks who used to create those deficiency letters, those not substantially equivalents, or influence the withdrawals based on cybersecurity alone. So you can elicit from our subject matter experts, specifically Naomi Schwartz, likelihood of FDA barriers. For example, if you have symmetric cryptography using SHA-1, is examples of stuff that we have specific histories of. Another quantity, so that's time or likelihood of delay. Another quantity might be stock drop, which has a revenue loss, delay to market. So delay to market by 1 year, for example, would have an impact to market share, have an impact to burn rate. So startups or products that are getting to market, maybe they're burning at $1 million a month. Every delay to market might be a loss. A couple others. We also talk about labor and opportunity costs on labor. So when you've got vulnerabilities without continuous vulnerability management with SBOMs, you have a log4j. When you have a log4j example, there are some companies that went through months of searching for whether or not they're affected, whether or not, if they're affected, they were exploitable, and what to do about it. And that labor reduction, labor hour reduction is a quantity we estimate. There's another note. An investment analysis on moving from sneakernet updates to over-the-air updates might include estimates on saving, for example, the number of hours for service calls per year. So say you have 10,000 devices in the field, and each service call is an hour of $100 an hour. You can rapidly figure out that there's $1 million per patch for those $10,000 devices. And so you need to start doing that 4 times a year. Was it 10? Yeah, it's $40 million a year. You can save that amount of year in perpetuity with an over-the-air update investment. I hope that answered your question. I have another question. So, or Andrew, any others on providing examples of mathematical units on quantities being assessed?
I think that was great. I think the key we want to get down to is, if you're going to do math on these things, you got to put a unit on it, either whether or not it's a probability or dollar. Just, it's not actually helping you to express them in colors. Just, it's, even if that you have a wide range, or if it's difficult to get the exact number, you can put uncertainty around it and actually make it clear. You're just adding ambiguity if you're not adding the units to things. I might grab from where do we source the quantitative impact on various technical remediation. I want to grab that one just because I think how we did it was a little bit different than what we normally do it, but I liked how we did it. So what we're trying to do in many of these cases is evaluate the security profile of a device. So you'll notice that many of the traits that we were using were things that people would consider controls. So we developed this type of model to look at a before and after state of a various set of controls, so that what we're doing is we're estimating the before state with the current set of controls, but you can fix it and re-estimate it using the same model. So what we're doing is removing gaps in the control structure and using the exact same model to predict the likelihood. So it was a very decent way to incorporate both of those remediations as well as control effectiveness into how we estimate the likelihood and impact reductions. Basically improving the security profile, which then estimates those quantities. again, a lot of the model we showed today had placeholder values, but we are working with MedCrypt experts to develop some of the models that would go in place of those things.
I want to go back up to a question that was answered during our presentation. Isn't the impact of remediation effect as arbitrary as other subjective numeric guesstimates? I think there's probably a lot built into that question, and I'd love some use cases. So if you feel like putting a couple use cases into the Q&A, I could respond to them specifically. But I will suggest that the sneakernet to over there update risk return analysis or ROI analysis is a good example where the estimates are not subjective at all. Companies know how much it takes to patch a device with over the air, or sorry, with USB based updates with a service call. And sorry, I should back up. Folks on the phone who's not familiar with the term sneakernet, which is one of my favorite, when a medical device needs to be updated or any software device needs to be updated and cannot be accessed by the person who needs to update it remotely, they walk to the device, stick in a USB stick or some other method and update the firmware. So that's a sneakernet update. It takes labor. Labor doesn't scale. So when we want to do over-the-air updates, like we're all familiar, our phones get over-the-air updates. My car gets over-the-air updates. It takes a lot of new infrastructure that many companies don't have in place. And so taking that $10 to $40 million example that I just provided of the cost of patching down to a much lower marginal cost once the investment in the over-the-air update architecture is made, are very real non-guesstimated numbers. Or they're just as guesstimated as all the other revenue projections, installed base projections, and other business metrics that product manufacturers have to make. I also think that they're just generally, a lot of this modeling is viewed with skepticism, but it is a method to elicit and make more consistent and transparent the decisions that are already being made. So if there's a decision to put something in the market or to invest in a cybersecurity control or a policy, and those decisions are made at scale across a corporation, we can model those decisions. And we will model them just as uncertain as the decisions that are already being made. The big difference is that it's not a black box, it becomes a more transparent white box that can be inspected and improved over time. All right, Andrew, you're going to jump in?
That's actually a great description. The other thing I would say that we try to do is we try to make sure that the methods that we're using are proven to improve our end results. So I think everything that we showed here, I know there's a question about FAIR up there at the top, and I believe they do about the same stuff. The same idea is that we're using methodologies that we know to work. They're in other fields, especially the actuarial sciences. So we're trying to take a combination of different methods that have shown to improve answers and bring them into this modeling. And specifically take out methods which do not. So there's kind of the element of making the estimations, but there's also the ROI of the modeling method. And we try to always use modeling methods that improve accuracy and clarity. And the other counterpoint that we normally would make to that would be, if you aren't going to do it this way, how else would you do it? And if it scores, there's a strong body of literature saying that that might not be the most efficient methodology.
Thanks. So 2 more questions, I think we'll be wrapping up. So I see a question from Robbie say, one of the most pressing issues in cybersecurity is how to burn down the vulnerabilities, threats, meaning a solution to operationalize and triage the threats / vulnerabilities quickly. Is it possible to build the MTTI CD and map and calculate risk score for each device? So we are working on that. We didn't demo it today, but we're happy to demo in a follow-up and preview to HISAC. We'll be talking a little bit about how to score and triage each individual CVE that we map to SBOMs. So Robbie, imagine that we can pre-score a CVS, rescore CVSS based on vulnerabilities found and policies and knowledge of a device. With that pre-score, we could attach it to a model just like this. And then we have a running risk tolerance where that rescore will give you an alert to a particular vulnerability in a device going over a risk tolerance. So I'm glad you asked the question. It's exactly one of the use cases for this that we are under research phase on. There's still a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace on what is a matched CVE, how do you estimate its impact, how deep can you go into an architecture. So CVEs are really by component, they're not by product, and that's all work that is to be done at scale by the industry. I hope that answers your question, but there's so much more in how we can attach, and we are working on methods of attaching this type of modeling to CVSS scores and specific vulnerabilities that more for another time. And thanks, Shannon. There are definitely a lot of variables in each medical device and organization, making it difficult to define an interval before each review. I believe setting few standards / checklists that help manufacturers define that review frequency might be helpful. Fortunately, there are some checklists and some standards. Usually, a company commits to some sort of post-market vulnerability surveillance and patch frequency in its regulatory submission. So that's one. You may have already committed this to your regulator. And two, the regulator has post-market guidance. Some of those guidance say 30, 60 days. The omnibus bill that explicitly gave FDA additional regulatory authorities, and now by law, has a reference to patching frequency, I believe. And furthermore, you might have commitments to hospitals or customers or other buyers of medical devices, unexpected patch frequency, especially by severity level. I hope that answers your question. And we've got lots of risks start external to a business. Can this modeling incorporate external supply chain risks like shortages, export bans, changing regulations? The answer to that is probably it depends. And the answer to that is these modeling approaches are very fit for any decisions that need to be made. However, if the decisions are infrequent, meaning you only have to make a decision once or twice, or if the decisions are low importance to the business, you probably don't want to invest in modeling that you don't already know how to do in-house. We make decisions all the time, make the decision according to your business. But when this model and these modeling approaches shine when a corporation wants to make consistent and transparent decisions over time, when the decisions are very, very complex and prone to human error, which is true of anything that's decided on stoplights, and when you've got high volume variability and velocity. So basically, any really good use case for AI is also probably a really good use case for modeling decisions at scale.
The other thing I might just throw in there is these things can get much more complicated than what we're showing right now. The likelihood and impacts you could break down into a lot of different pieces. So you can incorporate a lot more than we're showing right now, but it does grow with model complexity. So we were just kind of, what we're showing today is really the starting point. It can go significantly further.
Right. All right. I deeply appreciate my partner Andrew's time and our collaborative work together. MedCrypt and Hubbard Decision Research are excited about the possibilities of this work. And we were supposed to show a page. I want to acknowledge that we appreciate the opportunity to work with some of our clients with real data and decisions. This is not just theoretical, but we're partnered, and we wouldn't be as confident in the methods if we didn't have the opportunity to work with our clients. So thank you. And furthermore, thank you very much for your time today. If anybody wants to follow up, feel free to contact us.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Shannon, as well. I think, as Shannon said, just let us know and we can talk a little bit more.